On a winter evening in a tiny mountain town, a widow in her 60s finds a shivering white kitten left in a plastic tote by the grocery store dumpster. No one wants it, and no one warns her that this little bundle isn't a cat at all, but a wild predator that could cost her her house, her savings, even her freedom. From that one impulsive act, Elaine sells the home she once shared with her husband, moves into a sagging cabin in the hills, and races against time, the law, and her own aging body just to keep a promise to something the world threw away. Will she be the one who saves it, or will it end up saving the years she has left? Before we start, hit the like button and make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so that you won't miss any new stories. By the time Elaine Carter stepped out of the grocery store, the late afternoon had already turned the parking lot into a shallow bowl of cold blue light. The mountains around Ridgway, Colorado, were just dark shapes against a sky the color of bruised porcelain, and the air had that metallic bite it gets right before more snow. Her breath came out in little clouds as she pushed her cart toward her old Subaru, the wheels clicking over patches of ice, the plastic grocery bags whispering against each other. It was the kind of quiet that only winter knows. No kids shouting, no lawnmowers, just the distant hum of the highway and the soft creak of frozen snow under her boots. Elaine had always liked silence when her husband was alive. It had meant comfort, books, the two of them reading on opposite ends of the sofa. 2 years after his heart gave out in the middle of the night, the same silence felt like a hollow room inside her chest. She had picked up canned soup and oatmeal, a half-gallon of milk, and the cheapest tea on the shelf. Enough to get through another week. Enough to not have to talk to anyone. She was almost at her car when she heard it. So faint she thought at first it was the squeak of a cartwheel. A thin, ragged sound, like air leaking out of a balloon. Then it came again, a hoarse, desperate mew that didn't quite sound right. Elaine stopped. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled the way they used to when a child would start crying somewhere in the library and she had to go find them. She turned slowly, eyes scanning the rows of cars, trucks with muddy tires, sedans dusted with snow, a red minivan with a crooked bumper sticker. The sound came again, a broken little cry from the far corner near the dumpsters where the light didn't reach. Her boots made small crunches on the packed snow as she walked toward it, one hand still on the cart handle, the metal cold through her glove. The smell of old produce and cardboard grew stronger near the green metal dumpster, and behind it, shoved up against the cinder block wall, someone had left a blue plastic storage tote with its lid not quite snapped shut. The crying was coming from inside. Her heart climbed into her throat. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, before she'd even seen whatever was in there. Her fingers fumbled with the stiff plastic latches, and when she pried the lid back, a rush of cold, damp air hit her face, laced with the sour smell of fear. Curled in the corner of the tote, on a crumpled t-shirt that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a laundry basket, was a tiny white animal. At first glance, it was a kitten, snowy fur sticking out in clumps, too thin, too small, eyes a cloudy gray-blue that caught the parking lot light and held it. But the longer she looked, the more wrong things she saw. Its ears were too tall, the tips tufted with little smudges of dark fur. Its paws were huge for its body, thick pads and claws tucked tight. Its tail wasn't long and graceful. It was short and stubby, like someone had cut it off halfway. The little thing looked up at her and let out another hoarse cry, mouth forming a perfect, pleading "oh," breath puffing white in the freezing air. "Ma'am, I wouldn't touch that if I were you," a voice called. Elaine turned. A stocky man in a greasy ball cap and a grocery store hoodie was lighting a cigarette by the employee's entrance, the flame flaring orange against his chapped knuckles. He jerked his chin toward the tote. "Somebody dropped that off earlier," he said. "Thing gives me the creeps. Look at its eyes. Manager said animal control's closed till tomorrow. We were just going to leave it there. Maybe it'll wander off." Elaine looked back down. The kitten, or whatever it was shivering so hard its whole body trembled, ribs fluttering under the filthy shirt. Its fur wasn't pure white up close. It had a faint, silvery pattern, like shadows under snow. It blinked slowly, and for a moment she saw her husband's old orange tabby in her mind's eye, the way he'd sleep on her husband's chest while they watched the evening news. "Wander off and freeze to death," she said quietly. The man shrugged, smoke streaming from his mouth. "World's rough," he said. "That thing looks wrong anyhow. You don't know what it is. Could be sick, could be wild. I'd leave it be." Elaine didn't move. The wind slipped under her scarf and made her eyes water, but she couldn't tell if it was the cold or something else. The little creature made a soft, rasping sound and tried to push itself closer to her hand, toes sliding on the plastic, too weak even to stand properly. No one wanted it. Someone had put a lid on the tote and walked away. That thought landed in her chest like a stone. Very gently, she slid her gloved hands under the tiny body. Its bones felt like twigs, its fur icy and damp. It tensed, then sagged against her palms with a sigh so small she felt it more than heard it. "You're going to catch something," the man muttered. "Ma'am, seriously." Elaine straightened, clutching the little bundle against her chest. She could feel the frantic thump of its heart through her coat, surprisingly strong for something so breakable. She looked at the man, at Petit Diwan, the dumpsters, at the endless rows of cars with people hurrying into the warmth of their homes. "I'm already alone," she said softly. "I can handle a little risk." The man rolled his eyes and flicked ash onto the snow, but he didn't say anything else. Elaine tucked the creature into the crook of her arm, pulling her scarf around it to block the wind. It smelled like cold metal and old laundry, and something wild she couldn't name. As she walked back to her car, the parking lot lights buzzing overhead, she whispered to it the way she used to whisper to frightened children hiding between the stacks. "It's all right," she murmured. "I've got you now. You're not alone anymore." The tiny white kitten pressed its face into the hollow of her neck and gave a low, rattling purr that sounded, in the quiet of the winter evening, like the soft growl of a distant engine starting up. Snow was starting to fall again by the time Elaine turned her Subaru into the driveway. Flakes drifted through the headlights, slow and pale. The heater wheezed, never quite catching up, but the tiny white body tucked inside her coat was hot and shaking, a little furnace against her ribs. Her house sat dark against the yard. For a heartbeat, she almost stayed in the car, listening to the engine tick and the muffled hush of the storm, knowing exactly how empty it would be inside. Then the animal pushed its cold nose against her throat with a small, rusty cry, and she reached for the door handle. The air in the kitchen was flat and cold, faintly scented with dust and stale coffee. Elaine set the grocery bags down and opened her coat. The animal blinked in the overhead light, fur sticking out in uneven spikes. Against the faded floral wallpaper, its coat looked almost too white, like fresh snow thrown onto an old postcard. Its eyes, up close, were a misty gray rimmed with blue, clear and watchful. "Well," she said, her voice echoing just enough to remind her she was alone. "Welcome home, I guess." It slid out of her arms and tottered across the linoleum on oversized paws, claws ticking faintly. Without hesitating, it found the floor vent and curled on top of it. When the furnace kicked on with a hollow thump from the basement, the animal let out a low sound, half purr, half little engine, that vibrated up through the boards and into her knees. "You're something else," Elaine murmured. "Snowy. That's you, Snowy." The name felt soft and right in her mouth. She warmed a little milk and tore bits from a leftover chicken thigh. Snowy sniffed the milk and turned away, but the meat disappeared in quick, tidy bites. No tentative licks, just sharp efficiency. Out of habit, she made a bed at the end of the sofa with an old flannel shirt of her husband's and a folded Afghan. Snowy nosed it once, then hopped up beside her instead. By the time the evening weatherman pointed at blue swirls on the map, the animal had stretched its long body across her lap and chest. Its breath smelled faintly metallic, like pennies and something raw, but its warmth seeped through her sweater and loosened a place under her sternum she hadn't realized was clenched. She dozed off with the remote in her hand and woke later to the soft hiss of the TV's sleep screen. Snowy was still draped over her like a white stole, eyes closed, that deep, steady purr rattling against her ribs. For the first night in many, she hadn't snapped awake at 3 a.m, reaching for a husband who wasn't there. Over the next days, her life settled into a thin, bright thread of routine. Put the kettle on, feed Snowy scraps. Rinse dishes while it watched from the back of a chair, gray eyes tracking every movement. It didn't bat at paper balls or chase its tail. Instead, it would vanish behind the recliner and then explode out in a blur of white, hitting a wadded dish towel with both front paws and riding it halfway across the rug. Once, when the shadow of a passing truck slid along the wall, its whole body dropped low, shoulder blades sharp, tail stump twitching with knife-edge attention. "You're dramatic, I'll give you that," Elaine said, trying to laugh, but the hairs along her forearms rose anyway. Mark from next door noticed too. One afternoon he stopped by with his snow shovel, cheeks red, knit cap pulled low. Snowy watched from the top of the bookcase, a pale statue against the dark line of spines. "That cat of yours looks like it's planning a heist," he said. "Big feet for a kitten. You sure it's not part cougar?" Elaine waved him off, smiling because it was easier than admitting the thought had already brushed her mind. She was dumped in a tote by the dumpster, Mark. If she were a cougar, half the county would know. He chuckled and went back outside, the scrape of his shovel on the driveway making a clean, steady rhythm. Inside, the house felt less hollow than it had a week before. When Elaine sat down, Snowy stepped lightly down from the bookcase, crossed the room, then leapt up beside her and pressed its head firmly into her palm. "You and me, then," she whispered, stroking the rough, soft fur. The lamplight pooled warm around them, leaving the corners in shadow. Snowy's gaze kept flicking back to those dark corners, as if it saw something moving there that she could not. Elaine pretended not to notice. She told herself she had rescued a lonely little kitten. Whatever else it might be could wait for another day. By the time February slid into March, the little white kitten wasn't so little anymore. Winter light still lay pale and thin across the hardwood floors, but when Snowy walked through it now, she cast a longer shadow, shoulders rolling in a slow, powerful sway that didn't belong to anything housebroken. Elaine noticed it first in her arms. What had once been a featherweight bundle she could scoop up with one hand, now had heft, a warm, solid weight that pulled at the muscles in her back when she lifted her. Snowy's legs had lengthened, paws broad and thick, the pads dark against the creamy fur. The tufts on her ears had grown into sharp little flags of black, like ink stains on fresh paper. "Big girl," Elaine would murmur, fingers scratching the rough fur along the spine. Snowy's body would arc into her touch, purr, rumbling so deep it felt like a small motor pressed against Elaine's ribs. The first gift showed up on a gray morning after a light dusting of snow. Elaine shuffled into the kitchen in her robe and wool socks, blinking at the cold. There, right on the mat by the back door, lay a small, limp shape. At first, she thought it was one of Snowy's toys, a scrap of cloth dragged from the laundry basket. Then she saw the tiny feet and the limp tail and the brown of fur against the faded blue mat. A mouse. Its eyes were dull black beads, its body neat and whole, just very, very still. Snowy sat beside it, tail stump flicking, eyes bright. She looked up at Elaine with unmistakable pride. "Oh, honey," Elaine whispered, a strange mix of queasiness and gratitude washing over her. The house had always had mice. This was practical, natural. She told herself that as she scooped the little body up with a paper towel and dropped it into a plastic bag, her fingers trembling just a bit. A few days later, it was a bird, a little sparrow with soft gray feathers and one perfect folded wing. Then, a week after that, Elaine opened the back door and gasped out loud. A young rabbit lay across the threshold, fur like soft brown smoke against the peeling paint, a red thread on the snow that made her stomach lurch. Snowy sat in the doorway, chest heaving gently, whiskers tipped in white frost. She made a low humming sound when she saw Elaine, as if expecting praise. The house didn't feel quite like a house in those moments. It felt like the edge of something wild, something that smelled of iron and cold earth. The kitchen light was still the same dull yellow. The fridge still hummed its tired tune, but the air seemed sharper, thinner. Across the fence, life kept moving. Kids' bikes lay in driveways. Wind chimes rang in high, brittle notes. Mark knocked on her door one afternoon, cheeks wind-burned, hands shoved in his jacket pockets. "Elaine, you got a minute?" he asked. She stepped onto the porch, pulling her sweater tight. Snowy watched from the front window, a pale shape behind the glass. "Neighbor 2 houses down says they've seen your cat on their roof at night," Mark said, tilting his head toward the street. "And my motion light keeps going off around 2 in the morning. I thought it was raccoons, but yesterday I saw her up on my garage, just walking that ridge like a tightrope walker. You might want to keep her in." Elaine forced a smile. "I try," she said. "She's clever, finds a way." Mark's brow furrowed. "Yeah, well, people get nervous. HOA sent out some generic email about unusual pets and wildlife concerns. You know how they are. I'm not ratting you out, I just thought you should know." That night, Elaine sat on the edge of the sofa with the laptop glow on her face, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She typed, "Big White Cat Colorado Wild," and saw pictures that made her heart thud unevenly. Lynx, bobcat, spotted coats and tufted ears, massive paws in snow. Snowy jumped up beside her, eyes catching the blue-white light, pupils wide, almost black. With a firm bump of her head, she closed the laptop lid and then settled across Elaine's lap, pinning her there. "Fine," Elaine murmured, rubbing the warm, muscled flank. "That's enough internet for one night." Weeks blurred. Snowy's play grew rougher. She liked to hide behind the armchair, body flat, tail twitching, then launch herself at anything that moved. A rolling sock, a shadow, once Elaine's own calf as she walked by. One evening, the leap came a little too close. Elaine felt the impact first, a solid thump against her shins, then the tearing heat along the back of her hand as she flung her arm out for balance. For a second there was no pain, just surprise, and the sharp smell of dust kicked up from the rug. Then the sting roared in, hot and electric. She looked down. 4 thin red lines ran from the base of her thumb toward her wrist, welling little beads of blood that slid into the creases of her skin. Snowy froze, ears back, eyes huge. The purr that had been building cut off like someone had flipped a switch. "It's okay," Elaine said automatically, because that's what you say to upset children and frightened animals. Her voice came out thin. She backed up to the sink, turned on the faucet, the gurgle of water suddenly very loud in the quiet kitchen. The cut burned as the cold water hit it, a clean, fierce pain that made her jaw clench. In the reflection on the dark kitchen window, she saw herself. Gray hair pulled back, shoulders hunched, blood on her hand, and behind her, the pale outline of Snowy sitting very still in the doorway, eyes two glowing coins. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the only sound the hiss of water and the soft ticking of the wall clock. The next day, when a neighbor asked about the bandage on her hand, Elaine laughed it off. "Clumsy," she said, "caught myself on the corner of a cabinet." At home, she unwrapped the gauze and looked again at the neat parallel lines. 4 perfect marks. Her heart gave a quiet, unhappy thump. Snowy rubbed against her leg, purring hard enough to make the floorboards vibrate. Elaine bent down and buried her face in that thick, wild-smelling fur, trying not to think about claws, or rooftops, or rabbits on the mat by the door. "You didn't mean it," she whispered. "You're all I've got." Somewhere deep inside, a small voice answered that maybe Snowy wasn't the only one who didn't quite belong in this house anymore. But Elaine pushed that thought aside, the way she had pushed aside the search results on her laptop, and let the sound of the purring fill up her ears until it drowned everything else out. It happened on a Sunday morning that already felt off. The sky was a flat, faded gray, like an old dishcloth, and the house was too quiet, even for winter. Elaine was in the living room, straightening a stack of magazines that no one but her ever touched, when Snowy decided to fly. The white cat, no, not a cat, she would think later, was perched on top of the tall bookcase, muscles bunched, eyes locked on a dust mote, drifting in a shaft of light. Elaine glanced up just in time to see her launch, a blur of cream and shadow sailing toward the back of the armchair. Snowy misjudged. One big paw hit the narrow arm, slid on the worn fabric, and her whole body crashed sideways into the coffee table. The sound was a sickening, heavy thud, followed by a sharp yowl that tore through the room like broken glass. "Snowy!" Elaine's voice came out high and thin. The coffee table rattled, a coaster skittering to the floor. Snowy scrambled up, but her left front leg folded under her. Useless. She tried to put weight on it and screamed again, a raw, wild sound that raised goosebumps up Elaine's spine. For a heartbeat, Elaine just stared, heart hammering, the world narrowing to that one trembling limb. The paw dangled at a wrong angle, claws half out, fur ruffled. Snowy's chest heaved, her breath coming in harsh, fast pants, her pupils blown wide so the gray was just a ring around black. All right, easy, sweetheart," Elaine murmured, more to herself than the animal. Her hands shook as she grabbed the old cat carrier from the hall closet. It had belonged to her husband's tabby. The sight of it made her throat close, but there was no time for that now. Getting Snowy inside was like trying to crate a storm. The animal jerked and twisted, teeth flashing, good paws scrabbling on the hardwood with a dry, desperate scrape. But when Elaine's fingers brushed the injured leg, Snowy went still, shuddering, and let out a low moan that made Elaine's eyes burn. "I know, baby, I know," she whispered, sliding the door shut with a dull click. The drive to the clinic took 15 minutes. It felt like one long, breathless minute stretched thin. The tires hummed on the highway, wipers smearing gray slush across the windshield. From the carrier in the back seat came small sounds, short, sharp breaths, an occasional soft thump when Snowy shifted. Elaine's fingers gripped the steering wheel so tight they ached. The sign for the Ridgeway Animal and Wildlife Clinic appeared around a bend, its green paint peeling, the little paw print logo faded by sun and wind. She pulled into the lot, parked crooked, and hauled the carrier out, the plastic digging, into her palms. Inside, the waiting room smelled like disinfectant and wet fur. A big yellow lab thumped his tail against the floor, and a nervous tabby in a soft-sided carrier let out a protesting meow. As soon as Elaine stepped through the door, everything changed. The lab's tail stopped mid-swing. He backed up until his rear hit his owner's knees, eyes fixed on the white animal behind the grate. The tabby went dead silent. Even the cockatiel in the corner cage fluffed up and froze on its perch. Snowy pressed her face to the front of the carrier, whiskers spread, breath fogging the metal bars. The room filled with the faint electric crackle of tension. Elaine felt every eye on her, on them. The receptionist, a young woman with a nose ring and tired eyes, glanced up. The polite smile she'd plastered on all morning slipped. What have we got there?" she asked. "Her name's Snowy," Elaine said, hearing the edge in her own voice. "She hurt her leg, jumped off some furniture. I think it might be broken." The receptionist stood slowly, leaning over the counter for a better look. Snowy's tufted ears flattened, and that deep, unfamiliar rumble started in her chest, more growl than purr. "I'm going to get Dr. Patel," the woman said. Her voice had dropped a little. "Please, don't open the carrier, okay?" She slipped through a door, letting it close softly behind her. The clock on the wall ticked too loudly. Elaine could smell her own fear now, sharp and sour under the clinic's chemical clean. When the door opened again, Dr. Raj Patel came out, still fastening the cuff of his white coat. He was in his 50s, with salt and pepper hair curling at his collar and kind eyes behind smudged glasses. Elaine knew him from town, from farmers' market chats about good tomatoes. "Elaine," he said, surprised, "didn't expect to see you on a Sunday. Let's have a look at—" Then he saw Snowy. The rest of his sentence fell away. His hand, halfway to the carrier, stopped in midair. His gaze moved from the massive paws to the short, heavy tail, up to the pale, spotted coat and those cool, misty eyes. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's take this nice and slow." He looked at the receptionist. "No more dogs in, okay? And make sure the back door is closed and locked." A cold knot formed in Elaine's stomach. "Raj?" she asked. Her voice sounded thin, distant to her own ears. "What's wrong?" Dr. Patel crouched down to Snowy's level, staying just out of reach of the grate. Snowy stared back, unblinking. The low sound in her chest deepened, a warning. "Elaine," he said without looking away from the animal. "Where did you get her?" Elaine told him. The grocery store, the blue tote, the bony little body on a dirty shirt. Her breath fogged in the cool air of the clinic as she talked. Her hands wouldn't stay still. She kept smoothing her coat, then gripping it when she finished. Dr. Patel finally stood up. He took off his glasses, wiped them on his sleeve, and put them back on like a man buying time. "She's not a cat," he said gently. Elaine blinked. "Of course she's a cat. I mean, I know she's different, but not a house cat," he said. "Elaine, that is a lynx, a young one, possibly a hybrid or leucistic. Her coloring is unusual, which is probably why whoever had her panicked and dumped her. But make no mistake, she is a wild animal." The words dropped into the quiet room like stones into a well. Lynx. Wild. Not a cat. Elaine looked at the carrier, at the animal who slept on her chest and purred into her bones. For a moment the room tilted. The walls seemed too close, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright, buzzing in her ears. "That can't be right," she said, but even as she said it, she remembered the rabbits on the mat, the rooftops, the way the other pets had gone silent when they walked in. Dr. Patel's face was kind, but there was steel under it now. "Elaine, Colorado has very specific laws about keeping wild predators, especially in a neighborhood. If Fish and Wildlife had found her in your house, this conversation would be happening very differently, and with more uniforms in the room." A wash of cold ran through her from scalp to heels. "Are you saying they'd take her?" "I'm saying they still might," he replied, voice low. "At her age, and with how bonded she is to you, she cannot be released. She wouldn't survive. The usual routes are accredited sanctuaries, zoos, or euthanasia if there's nowhere safe and legal. Euthanasia. The word landed like a physical blow. Elaine's knees went soft. She grabbed the counter to stay upright. For a moment she could hear nothing but the blood rushing in her ears and the faint, steady tick of the clock. "No," she said, and now her voice had a rasp in it she didn't recognize. "No, she was left to die in a box. I promised." "I know," he said, "and I believe you've given her the best you knew how. But what she is matters, for her sake, for yours, for your neighbors." He hesitated, then added, "There might be another path. It's not easy." Elaine swallowed, throat raw. Snowy shifted in the carrier, bumping her nose against the bars, eyes never leaving Elaine's face. "I don't care if it's easy," Elaine whispered. "Just don't tell me the only way to fix my mistake is to let her die." Dr. Patel sighed, long and quiet, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he looked tired in his bones. "All right," he said, "let's get her pain under control, and then we'll talk about what it would actually mean to keep a wild creature and do right by her. It won't just be about you and a cat in a little house anymore, Elaine. It will cost you more than you think." Elaine nodded, tears blurring the room into soft gray shapes. Snowy's pale form swam in her vision, the only thing in sharp focus. Whatever this animal was, whatever anyone called her, Elaine knew one thing with the same cold, hard clarity as the mountain air outside. She was not going to abandon her. Not again. They sedated Snowy and splinted the leg, wrapping it in soft white bandage that looked almost dainty against those thick paws. While she slept in a quiet back room, breathing slow under a thin blanket, Dr. Patel poured coffee from a stained pot and asked Elaine to sit with him in his cramped office. The overhead light buzzed faintly. Papers were piled in careful stacks, a faded calendar of mountain lakes on the wall. Elaine cupped the cheap styrofoam cup in both hands, grateful for the heat against her cold fingers. "I called someone," he said, "before we talk about anything else. Officer Linda Ramirez with Colorado Parks and Wildlife. She's on her way here." Elaine's stomach gave a slow, queasy roll. "You called the state on me?" "I called someone who knows the law and also has a heart," he replied gently. "I am obligated to report this, Elaine, but how it plays out can look very different depending on choices made right now. I'm trying to give you options." Options. The word felt thin as tissue paper. When Officer Ramirez arrived, she brought the outside cold in with her. She was in her 40s, compact, dark hair, pulled into a no-nonsense braid, uniform in forest green that matched the deep color of her eyes. A badge glinted on her chest, and the radio on her belt crackled softly as she shook Elaine's hand. "Ms. Carter," she said. Her grip was firm, her palm warm. "Raj tells me you've been caring for a lynx you thought was a stray cat. That about right?" Elaine nodded, feeling suddenly small in her thrift store sweater, her sensible shoes. "I didn't know. I swear to you. I found her in a plastic tote by the dumpsters. I couldn't just leave her there." "I believe you," Linda said. "Intent matters to me. The law cares more about outcomes." They talked for what felt like hours, but was probably less than one. Linda laid it out in simple, unsentimental sentences. Keeping Snowy where she was, inside a subdivision, in a small house with close neighbors, was a violation. If the state seized her now, the cat would go into a system that was already overloaded. Sanctuaries were full. Zoos had long waiting lists and their own rules. There were no guarantees. "What if I moved?" Elaine asked suddenly. The idea dropped out of her mouth before her mind had fully shaped it. What if she weren't in a neighborhood anymore? Both Linda and Dr. Patel looked at her. Elaine felt a strange, brittle calm settle over her as she spoke. "My husband left me a piece of land," she said, "up near the base of Miller Ridge. Old hunting cabin, a few acres. We used to go up there to fish. I haven't been since he died." Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup. "If I lived there, if I built whatever you say is needed, could I keep her with me? Legally, safely?" Linda was quiet for a long moment. The clock in the hallway ticked. Somewhere, a dog barked once, sharply. "In theory," Linda said slowly, "yes. On private rural land, with the right permits and an enclosure that meets Class II standards, the state can license you as a wildlife custodian. It's not a pet license. She would be considered a managed wild animal. There would be inspections, paperwork. You'd be responsible for every bite of food, every vet bill, every contingency plan in case she gets out." Elaine pictured the cabin, the sagging porch, the rusty hand pump, the way the wind sang in the pines. She pictured Snowy in a space big enough to run, to leap, to watch the world from a rock instead of a bookcase. "What would it take?" she asked. "Exactly." Linda listed measurements: fence height, buried concrete footers, double-gated entry, roofed sections to prevent climbing escape. She talked about heavy-gauge wire, lock requirements, enrichment structures so the lynx wouldn't pace herself mad. "You're talking about real money," Linda finished, "and real work. And at your age." She let the sentence hang, not unkindly. Elaine felt something flare in her chest at that. Pride, maybe, or stubbornness. "At my age," she said, "I have fewer years left to waste doing nothing that matters." Dr. Patel watched her over his glasses, eyes soft. "Elaine, this would mean selling your house," he said. "That's what you're thinking, isn't it? Using the equity to fund this." She hadn't let herself say it out loud until then. The house she and her husband had painted together, the kitchen they'd remodeled one slow summer, the bedroom still holding his shirts in the closet, every corner filled with ghosts and habits. "It's just a building," she said quietly. The words tasted like rust on her tongue. "He's not in those walls anymore. Half the time I feel like I'm walking through a museum of my own life. But when that cat," she corrected herself, "when that lynx curls up on my chest, I feel needed. That's worth more than drywall and shingles." Linda studied her face as if checking for cracks. "If you truly want to pursue this," she said at last, "I can open a file. We'll need to inspect that cabin property, see if it's even suitable. If it is, you'd have 90 days to get a compliant enclosure in place." 90. That's generous, and it's all I can offer. "If it's not done by then, Ms. Carter, the state will take custody. And I can't promise you where Snowy will end up." 90 days, winter to spring, a blink and an eternity. Elaine thought of her husband's old fishing hat still hanging on the cabin wall, of mornings when Snowy padded after her from room to room, of the blue plastic tote by the dumpsters. She thought of empty evenings and full silence, and the way her heart had woken up, painful and clumsy, when a tiny white creature pressed its head under her chin. "All right," she said. Her voice didn't shake this time. "Open the file. Inspect the land. I'll sell the house. I'll build what you say I need to build." Linda exhaled softly, as if she'd been holding that breath for a while. "Okay," she said. "Then let's see if we can make a life for both of you that doesn't break the law or either of your hearts." Later, driving home with Snowy groggy and bandaged in the carrier beside her, Elaine glanced at the familiar turn for her street and felt, for the first time, not comfort, but a kind of gentle farewell. The maple tree in the front yard, the cracked front step, the curtains she'd sewn herself, all of it was about to become part of a life she would have to let go. In the passenger seat, Snowy shifted, bumping her head against the crate's door, eyes cloudy with drugs, but still finding Elaine's face. Elaine reached over at a red light and slid her fingers through the grate, feeling the rasp of tongue, the warm breath. "It's going to cost us, girl," she murmured, "but I think it's time we both moved on." Selling the house went faster than Elaine expected. One week there was a yellow for sale sign stuck in the frozen yard, and what felt like the next, strangers were walking through her rooms, their voices bouncing off walls that had once held laughter and arguments and birthday songs. She packed her life into cardboard boxes that smelled faintly of dust and tape glue, leaving behind little ghosts. A nail in the wall where a picture had hung, a ring on the counter where her husband's coffee mug used to sit every morning. On the last day, she stood in the empty living room with Snowy hunkered in her carrier at her feet. Afternoon sun slanted in through bare windows, pale and thin. The house echoed when she closed the front door for the final time, the latch clicking with a sound that felt too loud. In the car, as she turned the key, her hands trembled just once. Then she backed out of the driveway and didn't look in the rearview mirror. The road to the cabin wound higher into the foothills, the town falling away behind her like a picture on a postcard. The land up there was different, bigger sky, air that tasted cleaner and colder, full of pine and distant wood smoke. When she pulled into the rutted dirt track that led to the old place, her tires crackled over patches of ice and last fall's leaves. The cabin sagged in the middle, its dark brown siding faded and peeling. The porch steps creaked under her weight, and the screen door screamed on its hinges when she pulled it open. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old wood, and a faint trace of her husband's cologne, long soaked into the boards. A single mouse scuttled along a baseboard and vanished into a crack. "Well," she said, voice echoing in the small main room, "home, sweet home." She set up a temporary chain-link kennel just off the back stoop, anchor stakes driven into hard, reluctant ground. Snowy stepped out of the carrier, sniffed the cold air, then paced the perimeter, with her bandaged leg held a little stiff but strong. Her pale coat flashed against the dark trees, and her breath puffed white in the chilly March light. YouTube became Elaine's new teacher. She sat at the wobbly kitchen table, laptop open, watching strangers in work boots and ball caps explain how to dig post holes, mix concrete to peanut butter consistency, tension wire so it rang when you plucked it. Then she went outside and tried to copy them. The first day she dug exactly 2 post holes. By evening, her hands were blistered under her gloves and her lower back throbbed with each breath. The cold seeped into her shoulders until they ached like bruises. Snowy watched from her kennel, eyes following every swing of the shovel, every careful lift of the 80-pound bags of cement. "You could at least pretend to be impressed," Elaine puffed, leaning on the shovel and squinting up at the stripe of sky overhead. Mark drove up 3 days later in his rusty pickup, tires spitting gravel. He climbed out, looked at the stacks of lumber and rolls of wire, then at Elaine's hunched shoulders and the raw grooves in the dirt. "You trying to kill yourself?" he asked, not unkindly. "Maybe just trying to sleep well at night," she said, wiping sweat and grit from her forehead with the back of her wrist. He stayed. For the next week he came up after closing his garage, hands smelling of oil and rubber, showing her how to brace a corner, how to use a post hole digger without wrenching her shoulder out of its socket. The two of them worked under a sky that shifted from icy blue to bruised purple, and back again, their breath fogging in the evening air, the clang of metal on metal ringing through the thin woods. Officer Linda drove up once to check the site. She walked the boundary with a clipboard, boots crunching in the frost, lips pressed into a thin line as she measured distance and nodded at stakes. "You're making progress," she said, glancing at Elaine's shaking arms, "but the clock's ticking. Don't forget that." Elaine nodded. 90 days. The number sat in the back of her mind like a stone, heavy and unbudging. The storm came without much warning. The radio had mentioned a front moving through, But by late afternoon, the sky turned the color of dirty cotton, and the wind began to tear at the tree line. Elaine and Mark worked until the first cold drops hit their faces, then scrambled to stack tools under the porch. That night, the wind howled around the cabin, shoving at the walls, rattling the loose window panes in their frames. Rain turned to sleet, then back to heavy, wet snow that slid off the half-built enclosure roof, with dull, thudding slaps. Snowy paced restlessly in her kennel, tail twitching, eyes bright in the lightning flashes. When the storm finally stumbled away toward dawn, leaving a heavy silence in its wake, Elaine stepped outside and felt her stomach fall. One entire side of the enclosure had caved in. Posts leaned drunkenly, concrete footers cracked, wire fencing sagged inward in a sad, tangled bow. A section of the roof frame had snapped, splintered wood jutting like broken bones. For a long moment she just stood there, blinking against the thin, icy sunlight. Her breath puffed in front of her face, uneven. Her fingers had gone numb, but when she looked down, she realized she was gripping the porch rail so hard her knuckles had turned white. All that work, all those aching nights, half of it gone in a single, ugly night of wind. Her chest tightened, not the quick, breathless squeeze of panic, but a deep, slow pressure right behind her breastbone. It felt like someone was sitting there, heavy and unforgiving. She pressed her hand flat against it, fingers trembling. "Not now," she whispered to no one. "Please, not now." Snowy watched from the kennel, fur fluffed against the cold, eyes shifting between Elaine and the wrecked fence. She let out a short, frustrated yowl that echoed off the trees. Elaine walked down into the churned mud, boots sinking. She touched one of the leaning posts. The damp wood was cold and rough under her palm. A drop of water fell from the bent wire and slipped under her collar, icy against the back of her neck. For a moment her knees felt like they might just fold. Mark's truck didn't appear on the road that morning. It was Sunday. He had told her he'd be taking his mother to church in town. Linda wasn't due back for 2 more weeks. The cabin stood small and alone against the pale sky, and Elaine felt smaller still. Back inside, her hand shook as she filled the kettle. The whistle seemed too shrill when it finally screamed. The tea tasted weak, the mug heavy in her tired fingers. The pressure in her chest eased a little once she sat down, leaving behind a dull ache that made her acutely aware of her own heartbeat. Later, she pulled a camp chair up beside Snowy's kennel. The links pressed close to the fence, and Elaine reached through, burying her fingers in that thick, wild fur. It smelled of straw and cold air and something untamed that no amount of human effort would ever sand down. "I don't know if I can do this," she said softly. The words surprised her. She hadn't meant to say them out loud. "I might have bitten off more than I can chew this time, girl." Snowy closed her eyes and pushed harder into Elaine's hand, a deep, throaty rumble starting up in her chest. It wasn't a cat's purr. It was lower, rougher, like a distant diesel engine idling. It vibrated up through Elaine's bones into that sore spot in her chest. She leaned her forehead against the cold metal of the fence, eyes stinging. The half-built cage loomed behind her, crooked and broken against the fragile blue of the sky. "You deserved better than a plastic tote by a dumpster," she whispered, "and better than a tired old woman who doesn't know what she's doing." Snowy opened her eyes and stared at her, unblinking. In that gaze there was no blame, no doubt, just recognition, just trust. Elaine stayed there until the sun slid behind the treacheas and the air turned sharp again, her fingers numb against Snowy's fur. The storm had taken half the work, but the other half still stood. So did she, for now. Whether it would be enough. That was a question the wind carried away into the pines, with no answer echoing back. The days after the storm blurred into a gray smear of sore muscles and half-slept nights. Elaine moved like an old wind-up toy that had been cranked one click too far. Still going, but with a wobble in every step. She patched what she could of the broken fence with salvaged wire, knowing it was nowhere near what the state required. The good wire, the heavy posts, the roof panels she still needed, that all cost money she no longer had. One evening, after a day of wrestling with a bent section of chain link that refused to lie straight, she sat at the rickety kitchen table with her laptop open. The cabin smelled of damp boots, instant coffee, and the faint musk of Snowy drifting in from the kennel outside. The only light came from the cheap overhead fixture and the cold blue glow of the screen. Her hands hovered over the keys. She wasn't a person who asked for help. Years of being Mrs. Carter, the librarian, had taught her to be the one quietly fixing things in the background. Finding the lost book, soothing the upset child, straightening the crooked display. But this was bigger than crooked shelves. She started typing. She wrote about the blue plastic tote in the grocery store parking lot, about the little white creature that had shivered in her hands like a broken bird. She wrote about the surprise of Snowy's paws, the pride in those first gifts on the mat, the day Dr. Patel looked her in the eye and said the word lynx. She admitted, in plain black letters, that she had made mistakes, that she had loved something she did not understand and had nearly gotten them both into trouble. She wrote about selling the house, about the cabin, about post holes and concrete, and the storm that had yanked half her work down in one angry breath of wind. She did not ask for money outright. She just laid it all out on the table, like one of the battered decks of cards she used to keep at the library for kids who'd finished their homework. When she hit post on the local wildlife group's page, her fingers shook. For a moment she thought the lights dimmed, though she knew that was just her own blood rushing in her ears. The first comments came within minutes, a little ping each time, like a drip. In a sink. This is heartbreaking. What a story. Bless you for trying, but that animal belongs in a sanctuary, not with an old lady. That one stung. So did the words irresponsible and dangerous that popped up from a man whose profile picture was a truck and a fish. Someone else suggested she should have turned Snowy over immediately and let the professionals deal with her. But there were other voices too. A woman whose profile photo showed two old dogs wrote, "I'm a widow too, I get it." Another said, "My boys still talk about Mrs. Carter, the library lady." Is this you? You taught my oldest to love reading. Elaine stared at that one until her eyes blurred. Yes, she typed back, that's me. She went to bed with the laptop still humming on the table, the screen gone dark. Outside, the night wrapped around the cabin, full of the whisper of pine needles and Snowy's soft pacing in the kennel. In the morning, her phone buzzed itself nearly off the counter while she was still rubbing sleep from her eyes. There were notifications stacked on notifications, little red numbers blooming like berries. Her post had been shared, first to a Ridgeway community group, then to a page called Mountain Town Stories that she dimly remembered someone mentioning at the farmer's market. By noon, a dusty Subaru came grinding up the cabin's drive. A young woman in jeans and a flannel shirt climbed out, carrying a camera bag and a thermos. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her cheeks were pink from the cold. "Ms. Carter?" she called. "I'm Jess. I run Mountain Town Stories. I read what you wrote. Would you mind if I talk to you on camera? I think folks might want to see the face that goes with that post." Elaine hesitated, wiping her hands on her worn jeans. Then she looked at the half-fallen fence, at Snowy's pale shape behind the wire. "All right," she said, "but no special lighting. I'm too old to fuss with all that." Jess laughed, a quick surprise sound. "Fair enough, ma'am. We like things honest anyway." They filmed on the porch in the thin afternoon light, the wind tugging at Jess's hair and making the microphone crackle now and then. Elaine told the story again, this time with the camera's small, unblinking eye watching. Snowy paced in the background, a ghost moving behind Steele. 2 days later, Mark pulled into the drive early, tires spraying gravel. He hopped out, waving a folded printout. "You seen this?" he asked, breath puffing white. "Elaine, you're on the internet." "I've been on the internet," she said dryly. "That's where the cat videos live." He shook his head. "No, I mean really on it. That story page, 100,000 views, last I checked, and comments. A lot of folks got opinions, but there's more than a few who want to help." As if cued, another truck turned up the road, this one with Ridgeway Steel and Supply painted on the Kia door in red letters. 2 men climbed out, both in heavy work coats, their boots ringing on the frozen dirt. "Ms. Carter," the older one called, "we brought that order you didn't place." Elaine blinked. "I didn't place an order." "Lady named Jess called our owner," he said. "Said we ought to watch a video. Boss said if a widow can sell her house to build a fancy cat cage, the least we can do is throw in some decent fencing. Paid in full. Anonymous donor." He tipped his cap. "Don't argue. We hate paperwork." Before she could find words, another vehicle arrived, then another. A battered van full of men and women in work boots. A small SUV that she vaguely recognized from school drop-off years ago. A woman stepped out, squinting up at her. "Ms. Carter," she called. "4th grade. You read us Charlotte's Web till half the class cried. I run a construction crew now. Some of the guys on my team were in your reading group. We thought maybe we could give you a hand with this thing." They came with tool belts and nail guns and thermoses of coffee that smelled mercifully stronger than the instant stuff she kept in the cabin. Someone set up a portable welder. Soon the air snapped and sizzled with the blue flare of arcs, the sharp scent of hot metal and flux filling the cold afternoon. Boards thumped into place, post holes were straightened and reinforced, wire was stretched tight enough to sing when plucked. Elaine moved among them like a woman in a strange dream. Everywhere she looked there were hands, young hands, scarred hands, brown, pale, freckled, lifting, steadying, building. Snowy watched from her kennel, ears pricked, tail flicking, eyes tracking the motion with sharp, alert interest. By late afternoon, the broken side of the enclosure stood straight again, braced and double-checked. New sections rose where there had only been stakes and string in Elaine's mind. The cage didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a promise taking shape out of wood and steel. Officer Linda's state truck appeared near sunset, its white paint catching the last gold light. She stepped out, taking in the crowded yard, the trucks, the half-finished structure, the woman on the porch with dust on her jeans and disbelief in her eyes. "Looks like you've been busy," Linda said, a wry twist at the corner of her mouth. Elaine looked at the workers, at Mark leaning on a post with sawdust in his hair, at her former students laughing over a crooked board they'd just straightened together. The cold bit at her cheeks, but her chest felt oddly warm, as if someone had lit a small, steady fire there. "I had a little help," she said. For the first time since Elaine had met her, Linda's gaze softened into something like real warmth. "Sometimes," she said, glancing toward Snowy's pale silhouette, "that's the only way anything worth doing ever gets done." Spring crept up the mountain in fits and starts. One week the ground was still crusted with old snow, the next there were shy green tips pushing up along the cabin's path. The air smelled different too, less like cold iron, more like damp earth and sap. With the steel company's donation and the sudden surge of willing hands, the enclosure took shape faster than Elaine would ever have believed. Heavy gauge wire rose straight and true, gleaming dull silver under the pale sun. Wooden platforms were bolted into the corners, big enough for a lynx to sprawl and watch the world from on high. A sheltered box of thick boards and straw stood at the back, the bedroom, Mark called it. A double-door entry system, 2 gates with a small human-sized hallway between, went in last, its hinges oiled until they swung with a smooth, solid sound. Officer Linda came by twice more before the deadline, ticking boxes on her clipboard, testing latches with gloved fingers. Each time, Snowy watched from her temporary kennel, muscles coiled, ears pricked, the wild in her just barely contained. On the morning of the final inspection, the sky was a clear, almost fragile blue, the kind that made the mountains look closer than they were. Elaine woke before her alarm to birdsong, a thin silver sound she hadn't heard since winter set in. Her heart thudded heavier than usual in her chest, each beat a reminder that this was it. Jess arrived with her camera, saying people would want to see the ending. A few of Elaine's former students turned up too, on their day off, standing in a loose knot by their trucks with hands shoved in pockets, faces solemn in the thin sunlight. Mark leaned against a post, arms folded, trying to look relaxed and failing. Snowy paced the length of her kennel, tail stump twitching, her coat bright against the dark wire. Every so often she would stop and press her nose to the mesh of the new enclosure, as if testing the air in her future home. The state truck rolled up in a plume of dust and gravel. Linda climbed out with her clipboard tucked under one arm. She wore the same forest green uniform, but she'd traded her winter hat for sunglasses. The mirrored lenses flashed as she looked at the structure, then at Elaine. "Morning, Ms. Carter," she said. "You ready?" Elaine swallowed. Her mouth felt dry as old paper. "As I'll ever be." They started with the perimeter. Linda walked the outside of the enclosure, hand trailing lightly over the wire, testing tension, checking for gaps. She knelt to examine the buried concrete footers, tapping them with a gloved knuckle. Inside, she checked the gate latches, the roof panels, the corners where an animal might try to climb. "It's solid work," she said at last, turning back toward the small human crowd. "Better than some facilities I've seen with more resources." Relief fluttered in Elaine's chest, but it was too soon to let it spread. One last thing remained, moving Snowy. They had planned it, carefully. Mark and one of the younger men carried Snowy's kennel to the double gate, the metal scraping softly on the packed earth. Elaine walked beside them, one hand resting on the top as if she could steady the animal inside with touch alone. "Slow and calm," Linda reminded them. "No sudden moves, no gaps." The first gate swung open with a low creak. They stepped into the narrow space between gates, closed it, and latched it. The air felt thinner there, squeezed between steel and wild. "Ready?" Mark asked. Elaine nodded. Her hands didn't feel like they belonged to her as she unlatched the kennel door and pulled it open. For a heartbeat, Snowy didn't move. Then she flowed out, all muscle and pale fur, landing on the packed dirt with a soft, solid thump. She lifted her head, nostrils flaring, pupils wide. The new enclosure opened in front of her like a whole world. Logs, platforms, the faint smell of pine needles and fresh straw. And beyond the far fence, through a place where the ground still sloped away and the trees began, forest. Real, untamed, blue-shadowed forest. Time seemed to slow. Snowy's gaze flicked to that open distance. Her whiskers quivered. Every line in her body pointed that way. Elaine felt her own breath catch, as if someone had wrapped a hand around her lungs. Without warning, Snowy lunged, not toward the big enclosure door, but sideways, toward a corner where the wire met the gate. There was no hole, no mistake. She hit solid fence with a thud, rebounded, then sprang again, claws scraping on the metal, with a sound like someone tearing a sheet of tin. Jess gasped. One of the men swore under his breath. Linda's hand went to the tranquilizer gun at her hip, thumb brushing the safety. "Wait," Elaine said. She didn't plan to say it. It just came out, cracked and urgent. She stepped forward into the little hallway between gates until her shoes touched the fence. Snowy whirled, sides heaving, ears flat. For the first time since the grocery store parking lot, Elaine saw something like true fear in those misty gray eyes. Not fear of her, but fear of something too big to name. "Hey," Elaine said softly. Her voice shook, but she made it gentle, the way she'd spoken to scared children hiding between library shelves. "Hey, girl, look at me." Snowy did. The world beyond the wire seemed to fall away. No onlookers, no clipboards, no cameras. Just an old woman with dust on her jeans and a wild creature caught between two lives. "If you go," Elaine whispered, pressing her palm flat to the cool mesh, "I won't blame you. You belong to the trees and the wind more than you ever belonged to my little house. But out there, people are scared. They shoot at what they don't understand." Her throat tightened. She forced the next words through it anyway. "If you stay," she said, "it won't be perfect. You'll have fences. You'll have my bad coffee smell. And Mark's loud laugh and Linda's clipboard. But you'll be safe. And maybe we can make this place mean something. For you. For others like you." Snowy moved slowly toward her, step by soundless step. Elaine could see every detail now, the salt and cream speckles in her coat, the black velvet of her ear tips, the faint scar where the broken leg had healed. The lynx's breath fogged the wire, leaving tiny diamonds of moisture that caught the light. Then, very deliberately, Snowy lowered her head and pressed her forehead against the fence where Elaine's hand waited. The contact was firm, almost forceful. A deep, rolling rumble started in her chest, traveling through the metal into Elaine's bones. The air went out of the moment with an audible sigh. Behind her, someone sniffed. Someone else chuckled shakily. Linda's hand eased away from her holster. "Okay," the officer said quietly. That's pretty clear." They coaxed Snowy through the inner gate with patience and a handful of raw meat, closing it behind her with a sharp, final clack. The lynx trotted a few steps into her new space, then bounded up onto the nearest wooden platform in one fluid leap. From there, she surveyed her enclosure, tail stump twitching, ears forward. The sunlight turned the pale fur along her back almost golden. Linda filled out the last of her paperwork leaning against her truck bed. The pen scratched on the form, the sound small but somehow momentous. Finally, she snapped the clipboard shut and handed Elaine a copy, the official seal staring up from the page. "Congratulations, Ms. Carter," she said. "You are now a licensed wildlife custodian for one very particular lynx, and this," she nodded toward the enclosure, "is Lynx Hollow Sanctuary, pending the state's rubber stamp." Sanctuary. The word rolled through Elaine like warm water. She looked at the enclosure, at the young people still lingering by their trucks, at Mark wiping something suspicious from his eye with the back of his hand. "Thank you," she managed, for not just seeing a mistake." Linda smiled, a real one this time, softening her whole face. "Oh, believe me, I see those too," she said. "But I also see people trying like hell to fix them. That counts for a lot." Years later, when the paper had yellowed a bit and the ink had faded just enough to look like it belonged to another era, the word sanctuary still held. 3 springs turned and passed. The cabin changed slowly around Elaine. New mug rings appeared on the table, these ones hers alone. Shelves went up with worn paperbacks and field guides to birds and mammals. On one wall, in a simple frame, hung a photograph Jess had taken. Elaine's weathered hand and Snowy's massive paw pressed on opposite sides of the wire. Lynx Hollow grew too. A red fox with a missing back foot arrived first, rescued from a trapline. then a great horned owl with one damaged wing who blinked slow and solemn from a high perch. Later still, a trio of half-wild raccoons moved into a smaller run near the trees, their quick paws forever busy. Every morning, Elaine pulled on her boots and stepped out into the crisp mountain air, her breath puffing white in winter, disappearing quickly in summer. She walked the fence line with a bucket of meat or rodents, stopping at each enclosure to check latches, count eyes, listen for anything that sounded wrong. The sanctuary sounded different than her old neighborhood. Less dishwasher hum, more wind through pine needles, the low murmur of animal voices, the creak of wood settling. Snowy, fully grown now, met her partway most evenings. The lynx moved like a piece of the forest that had stepped out of its frame, powerful and silent. She would pace along the inside of the wire as Elaine walked outside it, the two of them tracing the same path on either side of the fence. At a certain spot near a flat rock that caught the last of the light, they always stopped, ritual, habit, choice. Elaine would lean one hand against the warm metal. Snowy would press her head into that spot, eyes half closing, that deep, rusty purr starting up like an old truck turning over. For a moment, the fence didn't feel like a barrier. It felt like a line they both honored for each other's sake. Some evenings, when the sky burned pink and gold over the dark ridge and the air smelled of sun-warmed pine and dust, Elaine would think back to that grocery store parking lot, to the blue plastic tote and the little white creature shivering inside, the one everyone else had walked past because it looked wrong. She had gone there thinking she was just picking up soup and milk and cheap tea for another week in an empty house. Instead, she had picked up the frayed end of a whole new life. Snowy lifted her head, looking past Elaine toward the trees. In that gaze, there was still wilderness, still something no fence could ever tame. But there was also recognition, the same wordless understanding that had flickered between them from the very beginning. "You were never a kitten," Elaine said softly, more to herself than to the lynx. The evening air carried her voice in a thin ribbon. "You weren't a cat at all." The wind rustled through the pines in answer, and Snowy bumped her head once more against the wire, firm and sure. Elaine smiled, the lines at the corners of her mouth deepening, her chest aching in a way that felt finally a little like peace. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Before you scroll away, tell me this. Do you believe a bond like theirs could really exist? If this story touched your heart, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just remind you that sometimes the wild loves us back in ways we'll never forget.